The first thing I saw when I drove back toward my ranch that afternoon was the fence. Not a small barrier, not some temporary construction tape. An 8-foot wall of brand new steel stretched straight across the only road leading to my property like it had been there for years. For a moment I actually slowed my truck down, thinking I had taken the wrong turn. But I hadn't. I knew this road better than any road in the county. I had driven down it almost every day. For nearly 3 decades, my cattle trailers had used it. Feed deliveries had used it. My wife and I had driven down this same dusty road the day we moved onto the ranch, and now suddenly, right in the middle of it, stood a locked steel gate. I rolled the truck to a stop and stared at the bright yellow sign hanging in the center of the fence. Private property. Meadowbrook Estates, HOA Estates. For a few seconds I honestly thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe a construction crew put the fence in the wrong place. Maybe someone confused the property line. But then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The fence posts weren't temporary. They were cemented deep into the ground. Whoever built this hadn't made a mistake. They built it to stay. I stepped out of the truck and walked up to the gate. Beyond it I could see the familiar dirt road stretching another half-mile to my barn, the wind pushing through the grass fields, the same way it always had. My land was right there, and yet suddenly it felt like it was miles away. A small metal keypad had been bolted onto the gate. Next to it was a number for the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. So I pulled out my phone and called. The woman who answered didn't sound confused when I explained the situation. She didn't sound apologetic either. In fact, she sounded almost entertained. "Sir," she said calmly, "that road now belongs to Meadowbrook Estates. If you wish to access the property beyond the gate, you'll need to submit a request through the HOA. I actually laughed at first, because the alternative was getting angry. "You're telling me I need permission to reach my own ranch?" There was a short pause on the line. Then she replied in the most polite voice imaginable. "Yes, sir, that would be correct." And that was the moment I realized something very important. This fence wasn't a mistake. It was the opening move in a war I didn't even know had started yet. The woman on the phone introduced herself before hanging up. Her name was Vivian Ashworth, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. At the time, the name didn't mean much to me, but it didn't take long to learn exactly who she was and why that fence had suddenly appeared across my road. Vivian had moved into Meadowbrook Estates about 2 years earlier, buying one of the largest houses in the subdivision, a massive modern place that looked more like a glass office building than a home. Within 6 months of arriving, she somehow managed to get herself elected as HOA president, and once she had that position, the entire neighborhood quickly started operating the way she wanted. Strict rules, endless regulations, perfect lawns, perfect sidewalks, and according to Vivian, my ranch was none of those things. The first time she ever spoke to me was actually about a year before the fence went up. She drove out to my property in a spotless white SUV, wearing a business suit that probably cost more than my entire monthly feed bill. She stepped out of the vehicle, looked across the pasture where my cattle were grazing, and immediately wrinkled her nose like she had just walked past a landfill. "You own all of this?" she asked. I nodded. She didn't look impressed. Instead, she looked annoyed. Vivian started explaining how Meadowbrook Estates was a premium residential community and how my ranch was creating what she called quality of life concerns for the homeowners. Apparently, the smell of livestock sometimes drifted toward the subdivision when the wind changed. The sound of tractors early in the morning had also generated complaints. Even the sight of farm equipment parked near my barn was, according to her, damaging the neighborhood's visual standards. At first I thought she was joking, because the subdivision had been built right next to a working ranch that had existed for decades. Anyone buying a house there could see the barns, the cattle, and the open pasture from a mile away. But Vivian wasn't joking. She told me developers had already shown interest in purchasing my land. According to her, if the ranch was sold and turned into another residential section, the value of every home in Meadowbrook Estates would increase dramatically. Then she made me an offer. It sounded generous at first glance. Enough money that a lot of people probably would have taken it without thinking twice. But I didn't even consider it, because this ranch wasn't just land to me. My wife and I built it together from the ground up. Every fence post, every barn beam, every acre of pasture had a memory attached to it. So I told Vivian the same thing I had told every developer before her. The ranch wasn't for sale. And when I said that, the polite smile on her face disappeared almost instantly. Looking back now, that was the moment everything really began. Because Vivian Ashworth wasn't the type of person who accepted the word no. And if she couldn't convince me to sell my land, she was apparently willing to make sure I couldn't use it at all. At first, the fence was just an inconvenience, a locked gate across the road. Annoying, sure, but I figured it would get sorted out once the county realized what the HOA had done. What I didn't realize yet was that the fence wasn't the real attack. It was only the beginning. 3 days after the gate appeared, the first letter showed up in my mailbox. It came in a thick white envelope stamped with the Meadowbrook Estates HOA logo. Inside was a formal notice claiming my ranch was in violation of multiple community environmental standards, which made absolutely no sense. My ranch wasn't part of their HOA. But the letter didn't seem to care about that detail. It listed complaints from residents about livestock odors drifting toward the subdivision, excessive agricultural noise during early morning hours, and visual disturbances caused by farm equipment being visible from nearby homes. At the bottom of the page was a warning stating that continued violations could result in financial penalties. I tossed the letter on the kitchen table and forgot about it. Then the second letter arrived. This one was different. It wasn't a warning. It was a bill. According to the HOA, I owed them $3,500 for violating neighborhood environmental regulations. They claimed the fine had been approved during an HOA board meeting, and that additional penalties would follow if the issues weren't resolved. I called the number on the letter and asked how exactly they expected me to follow HOA rules when my ranch wasn't even part of their community. The person on the phone calmly explained that because the access road now belonged to Meadowbrook Estates, any property using that road was required to comply with HOA standards, which was ridiculous. But Vivian clearly didn't care about logic. Over the next few weeks, the situation escalated quickly. Feed delivery trucks arrived at the gate and were turned away by private security hired by the HOA. My veterinarian tried to visit the ranch one afternoon and was told the road beyond the gate was restricted. Even a utility maintenance crew attempting to check a power line on my property was denied entry. Every few days another letter arrived, more fines, more complaints, more threats about legal action. The total climbed past $10,000 within a month, and the whole time Vivian kept repeating the same message through official HOA notices. If the ranch was creating problems for the community, maybe the easiest solution would be to sell it. That was when I finally understood her real strategy. She wasn't just trying to annoy me, she was trying to trap me. If trucks couldn't reach the ranch, I couldn't run cattle. If inspectors couldn't access the property, permits would start failing. If the fines kept stacking up, eventually the land would become more trouble than it was worth. Vivian believed that sooner or later I'd give up and accept one of those developer offers. Standing there at the locked gate, watching another delivery truck turn around, I realized something. From her perspective, the plan was working perfectly. What she didn't know was that while she was busy building pressure on my ranch, I had already made a move she never saw coming. What Vivian didn't realize was that the land around Meadowbrook Estates had a history, a complicated one that most people had completely forgotten about. And buried somewhere inside, that history was a detail that was about to ruin her entire plan. A few weeks before the fence appeared, I had been sitting in the county records office going through old property documents. Not because I suspected anything at the time, but because ranchers learned quickly that land disputes almost always come down to paperwork. And when developers started circling your property the way they had been circling mine, it never hurt to know exactly what the old deeds said. That was when I found the name Frank Mueller. Back in the early 1960s, Frank had owned almost everything in this area, hundreds of acres of farmland that stretched across the valley long before any subdivisions existed. When the land was eventually divided and sold off to developers decades later, most of it was turned into residential property. Roads were built, houses went up, and eventually Meadowbrook Estates appeared right next to my ranch. But when Frank sold the land, and he had insisted on including a series of legal easements inside the deeds, at first glance they looked ordinary, typical access rights, utility agreements, things like that. But one particular clause caught my attention. It described a small 2-acre parcel located near the entrance road to the subdivision. According to the documents, that parcel carried a very unusual condition tied directly to the main access gate for the entire neighborhood. The wording was old and complicated, written in the kind of legal language that takes 3 readings to fully understand. But the meaning was surprisingly clear once I broke it down. Control of the subdivision's entrance gate could not be modified, replaced, or permanently locked without authorization from the owner of that specific 2-acre parcel. In other words, whoever owned that tiny piece of land held a legal say in how the entrance to Meadowbrook Estates operated. I leaned back in the chair at the records office and read the clause again just to be sure I hadn't misunderstood it. 2 acres. That was it. A small strip of land sitting near the front of the subdivision that most people probably assumed was useless. According to the tax records, it had been abandoned for years. No house, no business, just an old storage shed and some weeds, which explained why the developers never bothered to buy it when they built Meadowbrook Estates. And apparently the HOA never bothered to research it either. But when I saw that clause in the deed records, I realized something immediately. If Vivian was planning to control the only road to my ranch, then maybe it was time I started paying attention to the only property that might control the entrance to her neighborhood. So later that same week, I contacted the county office and asked a simple question. Who currently owns the Mueller parcel? The clerk checked the computer for a moment before answering. No one's purchased it in years, she said. It's still available. And right then, without telling anyone, not the developers, not the HOA, and definitely not Vivian Ashworth, I quietly bought it. At first glance, the 2-acre Mueller parcel looked completely worthless. If you drove past it without knowing the history, you'd probably assume it was just another abandoned patch of land that nobody cared about. The grass had grown wild, weeds pushed through the gravel, and the only structure standing on the property was a weathered wooden shed that looked like it might collapse in the next strong wind. That was exactly why no developer had ever bothered to buy it. But the moment I stepped onto that property for the first time, I wasn't looking at the weeds or the broken shed. I was looking at the position of the land itself. The parcel sat right beside the main entrance road to Meadowbrook Estates, close enough that I could clearly see the tall metal security gate the subdivision had installed a few years earlier. Every resident who lived inside that neighborhood had to pass through that gate to reach their homes. It was the only entrance. At the time, I still didn't know exactly what the old easement clause meant in practical terms. Legal documents from the 1960s can be vague, and sometimes the physical systems they reference disappear over time. But something about that clause suggested there had once been a mechanical control tied to the gate. So I walked over to the old shed. The door creaked open when I pushed it, and dust drifted through the sunlight coming from a broken window. Inside there wasn't much, just some rusted tools, an empty oil drum, and a cracked concrete floor that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. For a moment I thought, maybe the mechanism had been removed years ago. Then I noticed something strange. Near the back corner of the shed, a square outline was visible in the concrete floor. The edges were slightly raised, like a panel that had been sealed over a long time ago. I brushed away some dirt and found a small metal ring embedded in the center. Curious, I grabbed the ring and pulled. The panel lifted with a heavy scrape, revealing a steel hatch underneath. Beneath that hatch was a narrow maintenance chamber, just large enough for someone to climb down inside. Old wiring ran along the walls, and mounted in the center was a thick mechanical housing connected to a heavy steel rod that disappeared underground in the direction of the subdivision gate. It didn't take long to understand what I was looking at. Back in the early days, before electronic systems became common, developers often installed manual overrides for important infrastructure. If the power went out or the electronic controls failed, someone needed a way to operate the gate manually, and this was that system. Bolted onto the side of the housing was a brass lock cylinder, darkened with age but still intact. Next to it was a faded metal plate with a stamped label that read, "Authorized key required for manual gate control." For a moment I just stared at it, because suddenly the wording of that old easement clause made perfect sense. The owner of this tiny 2-acre property wasn't just some random landholder. They were the only person legally allowed to access the manual control system for the entire entrance gate to Meadowbrook Estates. And now that owner was me. For a while, I didn't touch the gate control system at all. I could have used it the day I discovered it, but that wouldn't have accomplished much. Vivian would have called it sabotage, blamed the ranch, and probably found some legal trick to spin the story in her favor. If I was going to play this game, I needed to wait for the right moment. So I waited. Meanwhile, the HOA kept pushing harder. More fines arrived in the mail. Security guards at the gate started turning away almost every truck trying to reach my ranch. At one point, even a livestock feed delivery was denied access, forcing the driver to unload bags half a mile down the road so I could haul them in myself. Vivian clearly believed the pressure was working, and honestly, she looked confident every time I saw her. A few times I noticed her standing near the gate when I drove up, watching as another delivery truck turned around. She always had the same small smile on her face, the kind people wear when they're absolutely certain they're winning. But what Vivian didn't realize was that the entire time she was tightening the pressure on my ranch, I was quietly watching the traffic flowing into Meadowbrook Estates. Every evening around the same time, the same pattern appeared. Residents returning from work, cars lining up at the entrance, SUVs, electric cars, delivery vans, school pickups, dozens of vehicles passing through the neighborhood gate within a short window, which meant if the gate ever stopped working during that time, the entire subdivision would feel it immediately. So I chose a Thursday, around 6:30 in the evening, just as the line of returning commuters started building outside the entrance. I drove over to the old shed on the Mullah parcel. The air was quiet, the sky beginning to turn orange as the sun dropped toward the horizon. Inside the shed, everything was exactly the way I had left it. Dust in the corners, rust on the tools, and the steel hatch sitting in the concrete floor. I lifted the hatch and climbed down into the narrow chamber beneath it. The mechanical housing sat in front of me, connected to that thick underground rod leading toward the gate system. On the side of the housing was the old brass cylinder, the manual control lock. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key the county had provided with the property documents when I bought the land. It looked ancient, heavy brass, worn smooth from decades of use. For a moment I just held it there, listening to the faint sound of traffic building outside the subdivision entrance. Then I slid the key into the lock. The metal clicked softly. I turned it once. Above ground, something inside the gate system shifted with a deep mechanical clunk that echoed faintly through the chamber. I climbed back up the ladder, closed the hatch, and stepped outside. From where I stood, I could see the entrance road clearly. The first car rolled up to the gate and stopped. The driver waited for the usual automatic opening. Nothing happened. Another car pulled up behind it. Then another. Within minutes, a line of confused drivers stretched down the road as the gate stubbornly refused to move, and the entire time, the only thing sitting quietly in my pocket was the one key that could make it work again. By the time the line of cars outside the gate stretched halfway down the road, the confusion had turned into frustration. Drivers were stepping out of their vehicles now, staring at the gate like it had personally betrayed them. A few people pressed the keypad over and over. Others waved their remotes at the sensor like that might magically wake it up. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. Car horns started echoing across the quiet valley. From where I stood near the old shed, I could see the entire scene unfolding exactly the way I expected. Expensive SUVs, Teslas, pickup trucks, even a landscaping trailer, all stuck behind a gate that suddenly refused to listen. And the most interesting part, no one knew why. At 6:45, the traffic backup was massive. Cars filled both sides of the road. People were walking toward the gate now, trying to figure out what was wrong. That's when Vivian arrived. Her black Mercedes pulled up near the front of the line, and she stepped out already irritated. I could see her waving her HOA badge toward the keypad, like she was about to solve the problem herself. She punched in a code. The gate didn't move. She tried again. Still nothing. Now the irritation turned into panic. She pulled out her phone, calling the security contractor, shouting something while pacing in front of the entrance like a general trying to command a broken army. But the system wasn't broken. It was simply waiting. By 7 p.m., the HOA emergency meeting she had scheduled was supposed to begin inside the community clubhouse. Almost none of the residents could reach it, because they were all trapped outside. That's when I finally walked toward the entrance. People noticed me immediately. Ranchers stand out in a crowd of suburban commuters, especially when you're walking calmly toward a traffic jam everyone else is panicking about. Vivian spotted me too. Her expression changed the moment she recognized me. That confident smile she'd been wearing for months disappeared instantly. "What are you doing here?" she snapped. Instead of answering, I reached into my pocket. I pulled out the brass key. A few residents leaned closer, curious. Then I pointed toward the gate control box beside the entrance. "You know," I said calmly. "When this neighborhood was approved back in the 60s, the county required something called an easement agreement." Vivian frowned. I continued. "The road and the gate were built on land that used to belong to the ranch. People around us were listening now. And part of that agreement," I said, holding up the key, "is that the owner of the original property keeps manual control of the gate system." You could almost hear the realization spreading through the crowd. Vivian's face went pale. "You're lying," she said quietly. Without another word, I walked to the control panel and inserted the brass key. The mechanism inside clicked. The gate slowly slid open. Cars immediately began moving forward again, engines roaring as the traffic jam finally broke. But the real silence came from the residents standing near Vivian. Because in that moment everyone understood something she had ignored for months. The ranch she had been trying to eliminate was the only reason their neighborhood worked at all, and the key to the entire place had been in my pocket the whole time.